Hello, Facebook friends. Hello there. How are you doing today? Continuing on with Phantoms in the Brain review. I got a little bit distracted because I was watching an interview that Jordan Peterson did with Richard Dawkins. So I'm going to make a separate video about that. But that's been scrambling my brain for the last 24 hours or so. But let's just go through these chapters. Chapter 7. I think really the book starts to shift towards his examination of religion at this point in the book. But anyway, the title of the chapter is The Sound of One Hand Clapping. A lot of it is trivia that he talks about, the obscure events that he studies. So the first one is anosognosia. It's the condition where you're unaware of your own illness, and in this case it's the denial of the paralysis from a stroke. So a person has a stroke and they don't recognize that their arm can't move. They think they're still fine, and so he calls this term. And then other syndromes, one of them is called somatoparaphrenia, the denial of ownership of one's own body parts. So you think it's someone else's arm, not your arm. And he says, needless to say, both conditions are quite rare. Well, yeah, obviously, this is what the guy's studying. So, again, it's hard for me to get into the book because these are obscure, rare conditions when somebody has significant brain damage, neuropathy, brain damage. In any event, let's move on. Page 137, he says, will we deny the finality and humiliation of death? And I asked myself, why does he use the term the humiliation of death, right? It's obvious that he's concerned about death and the afterlife, but he doesn't want to make that the subject of his book, but he does unintentionally. He mentions on page 140 that stroke victims with denial are deranged. He used that word. He talks about experiment where they put ice water in the ear of the individual, and it creates this Dr. Jekyll and Hyde syndrome where they switch from one type of belief to another because of the way it is able to access the brain connection somehow in the inner ear. It's complicated. I'm not going to go into the details. Page 152, he quotes Thomas Henry Huxley, who was the grandfather of Aldous Huxley. He was a agnostic humanist. Some consider him the founder of anti-theism, that he was so opposed to anything to do with God. And so he quotes him about the denial and things. And then he gets into this whole big discourse where he talks about brain damage corresponding to Freudian defense mechanisms. So he introduces psychological concepts to explain the effects of brain damage, including denial, repression, reaction formation. Reaction formation is when you present the opposite sentiment to what you really feel. We call it reaction formation. Rationalization, humor, projection. These are all topics that Freud used to describe human behavior, but Freud never did any physical experiments. So Ramachandran is trying to do these basic experiments to prove or disprove the Freudian view of psychological behavior, so to speak. And he gets into a detailed discussion about that. It's kind of boring. So he says that there's three main advances that caused man to be dethroned from the center of his universe. And here again, he starts to drift into religion. The first one was the Copernicus revolution, when they discovered that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. The second was the Darwinian revolution, when they discovered that that you could explain the existence of animals through a long chain of evolutionary progression. And the third was Freud's discovery of the unconscious. These are, he considers, the three great advances that shifted man's opinion of himself, I guess you could say. So he says here, and he says that brain science is similar to one of these great advances. He says that because of brain science, he has given up the idea that there is a soul separate from our minds and bodies, and instead now I'm reading my own notes and I'm forgetting whether this is a quote from Huxley or from Ramachandran himself. I'll have to go back and double check it. He says that this is a liberating and joyous reunion with nature. And then he quotes the Upanishads, ancient writings from India. Brahman is all, become one with the subtle essence beyond all knowledge. So at the end of chapter 7, he really shifts right into religious thought and his own way of thinking things. So he says that because he's able to map out functions, different functions that the brain performs, that it has allowed him to give up the ideal of a soul separate from our minds and bodies. That's what he's come to the conclusion of through his basic experiments. To me, it's a great leap that he makes, especially considering he's only discovered a tiny fraction of human brain function, and he has nowhere touched anything to do with the esoteric aspects of the brain, or even the concept of volition itself, the concept of intention. He's unable to explain the origin of the concept of intention itself. Where do we get the ability to choose, to decide, to he says, oh, well, that's just based on brain function. Well, the damaged brains are he's able to map them to specific functions, but he's never able to match them towards feelings of love or mathematical inspiration. And even in his later chapters, he talks about these savants, but I'll move on, that are unexplainable. So chapter 8, I'll try and get through this quickly. The unbearable likeness of being. He talks about the Capgras delusion, and that's the condition where people think that the people close to them are imposters. And he introduces the experiment using a GSR device. It's called a galvanic skin response. It's like a lie detector, basically, when they put electrodes on your hands or fingers, and when you are exposed to certain stimuli, it increases the, basically your hands sweat, and it changes the conductivity in a electrical detector. So he says, he comes to the conclusion that our minds are governed by comparisons and not absolute values. This is what he believes is the summation of cognitive neuroscience to some degree. He also talks about Cotard syndrome, where patients actually think they're dead. He also talks about the Fragoli syndrome, where there's more connections than is actually there. People see the same person everywhere. And then for the author, for Ramachandran, he believes that these syndromes are again counter the belief that there's a soul, or counters the belief that there's a single I, as in identity, that exists as a single human being who endures in space and time. So he rejects that, and he basically believes that everything is organic. You can see that from how he's trying to explain things. So then we move on to chapter 9, God in the Limbic System. He quotes Einstein and Gandhi to start the chapter, and both quotes stating uncertain attributes and attitudes towards God. And so you can see where he's continuing on to this progression, where his studies continually remind him that he's more interested in the things of the unseen realm. He wants to answer the question about God, but everything that he studies reinforces his own preconceived notion as a agnostic, pretty much. He talks about a transcranial magnetic stimulator, which was used by Dr. Michael Persinger, a Canadian. He stimulated his own temporal lobes, and then he said he had these godlike experiences. And then the author, Ramachandran, says, oh, you should try it on Francis Crick. Now, it's funny that he mentions that because Francis Crick, he was the guy that developed the helix shape of DNA, and he was an ardent humanist. He was a complete anti-Christian, anti-religion individual, a hardcore, definitely, although he didn't come out and say it, he was definitely a hardcore humanist slash atheist. And that's why he says maybe you should try the device on Francis Crick as a kind of a joke, but it's kind of a lame statement. But again, every chance that he gets to quote an atheist or a famous atheist, he brings it up. He brings it up. He's constantly bringing up all these different views of atheism. No wonder the book was feted so much and given so many accolades, because that's what gains attention in the publishing world in our generation. So page 179, he equates Caesars. He tries to equate seizures, not Caesars, Roman Caesars. He equates seizures to spiritual experiences, in particular, spiritual experience of having a direct communication with God. And he says that people that have a temporal lobe seizures in particular have this experience. And so this is how he explains anything to do with direct communication with God, which is ridiculous because people that claim to have direct communication with God don't all have seizures, right? He takes those ones that do have those experiences and says, oh, that must explain all those experiences, which is a leap of faith on his part. He talks about temporal lobe personality, hypergraphia. People have these conditions when they had this damage to their temporal lobe epileptics in particular. And then he talks a bit about evolutionary psychology, Darwinian cause for a belief in God. He tries to propose something along those lines. And then, interestingly enough, he gets into savant syndrome, which does nothing to support his arguments. And he actually quotes Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin, and he worked together with Darwin on bringing his ideas to the public awareness. But he differed in one serious area, in that he believes that the human abilities had to have been conferred by divine grace, by God, because they were too complex to have evolved as Darwin posited. And so that's where they split in their belief, where we remember Darwin today, but we don't remember Wallace, which is unfortunate. But it's interesting that he does bring him up. First time he's mentioned somebody who's not an atheist. And then he gives some examples of savant near the end of the chapter, page 193. And he mentions that these amazing ability of savants aren't explainable to this point in time. And he talks about things like the creative genius, the literary genius of Shakespeare. They're not replicatable. So they seem to endorse the views that Wallace had, and none of those examples that he gives refutes anything that Wallace says. So it's interesting that he actually includes that in the book, that he does give a little bit of time, so to speak, to somebody that is at least slightly theistically inclined compared to all the other people that he's quoted so far. So that's it, chapter 7, 8, and 9. It's a torture to get through, and I'm sorry for going on about this because it is boring. But again, I've got distracted by this interview that I watched last night with Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins, so I'll be making a video about that. And what I did for that is I just wrote out a couple of pages of notes, and I'll just read the straight notes. So that might be a more worthwhile video rather than this one. Sorry to put you through this. Thank you again for watching. God bless you. Hope you have a fantastic day. Hope you have a better day than I'm having. Take care of yourself now. Bye-bye.